Hi folks, in order to prepare ourselves for the first project we're going to work on in Higher Design and Manufacture, we're going to start right at the beginning and look at design briefs. Now I know that this is something that you will have covered in your National 5 course, for those of us who covered National 5 Design and Manufacture, but something we need to look at in a bit more detail obviously for the higher course, and it's obviously good to refresh our memory even if we did study this in National 5. So there's a few things to go over, and we'll have a look at them just now. So from the course assessment document, the course assessment specification, we can see that the design brief is listed in the assignment section and in the question paper section, so we can be expected to show our skills in the final assignment at the end of the year, and we can expect to see questions on it in the exam. So in the assignment side, we're asked to analyse a design brief, and we're going to look at that today. We're going to look at what that means to analyse a design brief. And in terms of the questions we could potentially be asked in an exam, we can be asked about what the purpose of design brief is and the difference between open and closed design briefs. Now that's something you might have covered in the National 5, but something we will look at in a bit more detail again today. So the first question is, what is a design brief? A design brief is the problem or the task that the design team are going to try and solve or going to try and undertake. Normally, this will be set by an external client. So either be a team, a company, an individual, a person will come to the design team, to the team of designers, and present them with the design brief, present them with a problem that they are facing, or present them with a brief concept for a product that they would like the design team to fulfill and design for them. So it can come in many forms. It could be written, verbal, it could be done in person, online. But the difference between the two is open or closed. Okay, as I mentioned previously, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail today, the difference between an open design brief or a closed design brief. So the brief sets out the overall goals of the project, and will also set out any constraints that the design team might have. So the product might be limited in terms of the time that is available to it. So if we're thinking about big tech companies releasing their latest products, they might have to try and release their latest smartphone or their latest tablet or their latest computer, whatever it happens to be, within a certain time scale, okay, in order to meet their company goals, whatever it happens to be. Products might be restricted in terms of their material choices. So companies might be looking to be more environmentally friendly, and therefore will limit the material choices that the product can be made from, or perhaps it's just due to the location they are in the world. Perhaps some materials are less accessible to that company, and therefore materials are restricted. So if the client has particular needs in that sense, then they might be outlined in the design brief. Same comes to manufacturing or budget limitations. There might be limits as to what commercial processes are available, and there might be limits in terms of the finances available to the company, and therefore they might be outlined in the design brief. It's also likely to include success criteria. Okay, so what we would expect to see in a successful project, and ultimately that's what leads the development of the specification of the project, which we'll look at in a later lesson. Okay. So the design brief is important for both the designer and the client who sets the brief in itself. So for the designer, we can see it as a set of instructions for us to follow, for us to meet the wishes of our client. It's going to be the thing that we will constantly be referring back to as designers. We will need to refer back to what the client has actually asked of us. What problem are they asking us to solve? What do they want from us? We need to refer back to what they're asking of us, and that will be set out in the brief. Helps give focus. It will normally define some clear goals for us, and again, that will ultimately lead to the success of the project. If we choose to ignore those, if we choose not to engage fully with the design brief, then ultimately the product could fail. Okay, we might be ignoring the needs and wishes of the client, and ultimately that could lead to a product which is not compatible with their needs and their wishes. So ultimately could fail if we don't take enough importance when we're acknowledging the brief. For the client, it could be their only contact with us as the designer. It might be their only chance to communicate with the design team. So it's their opportunity to set clear expectations for their product. They want to set out exactly what they're looking for from the design team in the brief, especially if they are going to have limited contact with the design team. It's their chance to set out what they want. And at the end of the project, once the project has actually been designed and manufactured and prototype, etc., it'll be for the client to look back at the design brief, to look back and say, well, this is what we asked of you. This is what we asked of you as the designers. Have you done that? Have you successfully created what we set out in the brief? And they'll be able to refer back to the brief and use that. So the first type of design brief we can look at is an open design brief. Okay, so in an open design brief, it's set out very loosely. Okay, there's very little scope or very little, limitations placed on the designer. Okay, so it's often very useful for when we're designing brand new concepts or products, where the client themselves doesn't have a lot of technical knowledge. Okay, so if the client isn't very much aware of the latest developments in technology and materials, and if the client doesn't understand manufacturing techniques and manufacturing technologies and the pros and cons of different materials and everything like that, if the client themselves doesn't know an awful lot about that, then chances are the design brief is going to be very, very open, because they won't have specified those things. They won't know enough about those things to specify them. And therefore it's up to the design team, the designer, to make those decisions themselves, because they haven't been outlined in the brief. So it allows you as the designer to be much more creative and much more innovative, because the client hasn't set out a prescriptive list of things that it has to do. So although it gives us as designers more freedom, there is potentially the risk that we won't meet the client's needs. What our idea of the successful product might be might not match up with what the client's idea of what a successful product might be. So that is one of the risks of an open design brief. They won't give you a lot of restraints, it won't give you a lot of restrictions, but the openness there leads to openness of interpretation, and therefore our idea, the designer's idea of a successful product that meets that brief, might not be the same as the client's idea of a successful product. The opposite of an open design brief, of course, is a closed design brief, okay, where the problem is set out in a much more tight fashion. Okay, so there's a lot more specific points that the client will set out in the brief and that they want you to require or solve in the product that we design. So the client might have more expert knowledge in that particular field for the product that they're looking to design, so they might have the ability to give you more restrictions, the ability to give you more information, because they understand more about it. So for example, they could be limiting your material choices, they could be limiting the manufacturing techniques, etc. If they have more knowledge of that, they might try to limit the target market or the aesthetics of the product. It really could be anything. Okay, but obviously as design briefs have more specifications, they become more closed to us as designers to be creative. Okay, they in some respects can limit our creativity. So when we are presented with a design brief, whether it's opened or closed, it's helpful to ask ourselves questions. And there's 4 questions we've set out here that we'll look at. So are there any economic restrictions or demands? So are finances going to restrict the development of this product? Is it set out in the brief that the client has a particular budget? Have they set out in the brief that they're going to sell this product at a particular price? When we're considering material choices, are some materials going to be considered too cheap or too expensive for this product? So we have to consider the economic factors when we're designing the product. Second question to ask is in relation to function. What are the functional restrictions or demands? What does the product have to do? How does it have to perform that particular function? And does that restrict how we can look at solving the problem, look at solving the design brief. Are there any aesthetic considerations? So has the client specified particular material choices in terms of aesthetics? Are they looking for a particular colour choice or colour scheme? Are they looking for textures to be incorporated or not incorporated into the design? So we need to consider if there are any demands like that made in the design brief. And we also, of course, have to consider the environment. What effects and consequences will any proposed solution have on the environment? So will our material choices have an impact on the environment? Will our manufacturing techniques have an impact on the environment? Will the product itself have an impact on the environment? So, for example, a car or another product like that, which creates, toxic chemicals, which puts pollutants into the atmosphere. We have to consider what impact that might have and whether there's any restrictions in that outlined in the brief. If we properly analyse the brief, if we properly ask ourselves questions about how we can tackle the problem that has been set to us, it will now allow us to identify key areas to research. So there might be particular aspects that have been set out in the brief, such as a target market that we need to identify, or material choices, or the area in which this product is going to be sold in the world. A whole number of things can be identified from the brief that then give us areas to research, and it's with that research we'll be able to produce a quality specification, which ultimately will help us to design a successful product. So our next lesson, we will look at research techniques, and following that we will look at how we use that research to build a successful quality specification.